Hi, welcome to Health Horizons. My name is Mail. I'm an AI and health policy researcher at MIT. Health Horizons explores how AI is changing the way we understand, deliver, and govern healthcare. But this isn't just about technology. It's about power, people, and the policies shaping tomorrow's systems. Through in-depth conversations with changemakers and quiet disruptors, we spotlight the people actively shaping what care will look like tomorrow. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Hugh Harvey for this very first episode of Health Horizons. From radiology to the forefront of AI regulation, he's uniquely placed to talk about this crossroads between regulation, AI, and healthcare. Hugh, thank you so much for joining and welcome to the podcast.
Mal, thank you so much for having me. I didn't realize this was the first one, so yeah, I'm excited.
All right. So before we dive into AI and regulatory topics, I'd like to start with your journey. So could you talk us through the different steps, starting with your initial training as a radiologist and how you first got interested in AI?
Sure. So in the UK, you go to med school for 5 or 6 years, and then you do 2 years of foundation training as a junior doctor, and then you choose your subspecialty. So I chose radiology because I was always a bit of a computer geek. I did a lot of coding as a teenager, making websites from scratch in HTML and CSS. So I felt at home with computers, and I thought, well, the radiologists get to sit in front of a computer all day, so that's what I want to do. I chose radiology. It's a 5-year run-through training program, which I did down on the south coast of England, and I got my qualification in 2014. And then after that, I decided not to be a consultant straight away. I went into academia. So I applied for a research position at the Institute of Cancer Research, and I was looking at advanced prostate imaging techniques with MRI. And part of my research thesis, which took 2 years, was one of the projects was segmentation of structures. This was just at the time when UNETs had kind of come out and been a thing. People were segmenting photos of cats and dogs and things and drawing outlines around them. So I kind of thought, well, surely we can do this on prostates. And we had some success in that regard. I mean, this was early days, so nothing like it is now. So I got my postgraduate research degree. And then I thought, I don't want to be a consultant radiologist just yet. So I applied for a job in industry, and there was a company in London doing AI in health called Babylon Health. And I applied for a job there, and I got a role as one of the clinicians on the team.
So what year was that?
That was about 2016.
Okay, so 2016 is when Jeffrey Hinton has this very famous controversial quote about AI replacing radiologists within 5 years. Do you remember what your expectations around AI were at the time?
I was blogging a lot at the time as well. Since AlexNet in 2012, I think it was, won the ImageNet challenge, people have been saying, oh, well, we're going to use this in radiology. So while I was doing my research degree, I've been quite interested. I've been going to a few conferences, and people have sort of started talking about AI in radiology, and we'd start to see the first few papers around, convolutional neural networks, deep learning mechanisms. And so it was an idea. It wasn't in practice yet. When Jeffrey Hinton said that, that really sparked the race to dig for gold in radiology AI. But I knew, because I'd been hands-on with these things, that they were incredibly finicky and brittle, and there was some way to go before they were going to replace everything that a radiologist did. And I think, without speaking out of turn, I was a qualified consultant level radiologist with a research degree which had utilised machine learning. So I felt relatively well placed at this really early stage to publicly say, hang on, I don't really believe this is. And I remember writing a blog at the time saying, AI is not going to replace radiologists, well, at least in its current form. But he's been proven wrong completely. And there's this nice meme going around on social media. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a quote from Elon Musk saying, in 2012, 5 years' time, there'll be driverless cars, no one will be driving. And in 2016, Jeffrey Hinton says, well, in 5 years' time, there'll be no radiologists. And then in 2025, of course, normal radiologists are driving to work in normal cars, and nothing's changed. So there's a lot of hyperbole and hype in AI. And I've always just tried to approach it with realism and pragmatism. But nonetheless, so yeah, I got a job at Babylon Health. I worked there for a year, and that's when I fell into sort of medical device regulation. So Babylon Health was building a regulated medical device. The company was approached by the regulators here in the UK, the MHRA, and I was asked to respond. So I dealt with the MHRA.
To be clear, at that point, you did not have any background in regulation at all.
No. So by that point, pure radiologist with a bit of academic experience. I can't remember exactly how it happened, but I think I volunteered once I heard what was happening. I said, I'll do this. This sounds interesting. That was the pivotal point in my career, I suppose. But I worked with the OHRA and we registered the device as a Class 1 device. But we did, we built a full technical file with clinical evidence and everything. And it was the first Class 1 AI device on the UK market as far as I was aware. So that was a kind of sort of a milestone. I did a year there. I fell out of love with the company, to be honest. So after a year, I decided to move on. And I thought, well, what should I do? So I got a consultant job at Guy's and Tommy's Hospital in London. I became a locum consultant radiologist. But I didn't really enjoy it that much because my specialism obviously was in prostate imaging. That's what I dedicated 2 years of my life to researching. And I wasn't allowed to report prostate MRI at the hospital. I started doing it and then I got some emails saying, please stop. I sat there for a few months doing other bits of radiology, but in the meantime, I was still connected to the industry side of things. And I met a couple of founders out of Entrepreneur First, which is an accelerator here, and they'd set up Chiron Medical, and I joined them as their clinical director.
How big was the company at that time?
Oh, just a handful of people. I think I was like third or fourth person, basically. There was a couple of data scientists and a couple of leaders. So we worked on that for 2.5 years, and we managed to get Europe's first CE marking. It was Class 2A at the time for a deep learning based radiology device doing mammography screening. In a short space of time, I'd gone from being a radiologist to doing 2 of the world's first regulatory clearances for AI devices. I learned a lot during this. You can't really understand regulatory until you've actually done it. People are scared of it because they see it as this kind of very misty, grey, murky area. They think there's loads of documentation. I mean, there are lots of documents to do, but it is entirely possible to do, even with a small 4 or 5 man team. What I learned through those processes is that we'd use various consultants for various different aspects. So you have your regulatory, you have your clinical evidence, you have your health economics, you have your market access strategy. And then I just sort of thought, well, hang on, this could be streamlined. Like, thousands of other people are going to try and do this. And I'm pretty sure there's a gap in the market for people who know what they're doing. Certainly not many people have done it yet. So I set up Hardian as a solo business originally in 2018. And the rest is history. For the past 7 years, we've helped well over 150 companies on their journeys to market and getting CE marks, FDA clearances, registrations around the world, building and publishing health economic models as well, and helping people with their market access and IP. So that's kind of the journey. So it all kind of leads to a point. But if you'd asked me 15 years ago, I would never have guessed any of this.
So you nicely transitioned into Harding Health and what you do. When companies initially come to you for going through the regulatory process, what are some of the most common misconceptions that they have about the regulatory process? And also, more broadly, how it should fit within their overall go-to-market strategy?
That's a really good question. It has shifted over time. So look, 7 years ago, pretty much no one had even heard of medical device regulations, just like I hadn't heard of them when I was at Babylon and dealing with them for the first time. And people react differently when they find out about them. I reacted with a sort of deference to them. I thought, well, this is the law, I need to do it. As a clinician, I'd used medical devices in my practice. Obviously, all the radiology imaging technology are qualified medical devices, clearly. So I kind of had a respect that these things are demonstrably safe. They've been through a quality assurance process, and there's a science behind that. It's a well-documented process. So that was my reaction. Other people's reactions tend to be slightly different in that they're approaching it purely from a sort of software development angle. They're very used to building software, typically on the web, where it's largely unregulated. Anyone can build a website, anyone can build an online shop or anything like that, or an app for the App Store. And there's very little regulation, certainly no certification that needs to take place. And I think that thinking and that ethos of software development does clash with this quite sudden realization that actually I need to document everything I've done and prove every claim I'm making. And so people who've come from the software background and entering the healthcare space can react negatively at first, let's be honest, to the regulations. What I find is that you can take people on this emotional journey, really, from their initial denial and anger about the regulations to acceptance and actually pride that they're doing it properly. And it's a huge badge of honour. Not many companies, if you look at how many businesses there are worldwide, not many companies have a regulatory clearance for AI. There's 1,000 FDA clearances, but about 20% of those are repeat submissions. So let's say there's about 700-800 devices. That's a really small number. There's not many people who've actually done it. And of course, many of those are from the same companies. So actually, if you count the number of companies, it's probably in the 300-400 region. We've done about 150 of those. Customers are starting to be savvy. They're asking for regulatory type documentation. Certainly here in the NHS, people ask for clinical safety files, they ask for risk management files, they ask for cybersecurity documentation. That's all just part of what you do to get a regulatory clearance. And so the whole ecosystem has matured really significantly over the past 7 years. And it's been nice and rewarding to be part of that and be known for being good at what you do in that sector. So I feel incredibly lucky and privileged to be able to work with so many innovators and to be able to interact with the regulators and explain and give insights to my network about what's happening and what's changing in AI regulation.
When you interact with the regulators, what are the regulatory gaps that you see and would like to be filled?
So the largest gap, I think, well, there's two. There's an education gap. So the regulators are not particularly good at educating people on what they should do. They produce very technical guidance and laws and standards. And to be honest, no one in their right mind would read ISO 13485 if they didn't have to. Plus the fact you have to pay for it to read it. Like, there's no free version. So I think there's a kind of education gap. The other gap is a transparency gap. So people get a regulatory clearance, they have a CE mark or an FDA clearance or approval. And then it's just almost completely up to the company what they say publicly about that. There's very little information directly from the regulators. And that's because they traditionally treat all of that stuff as a trade secret. So whatever you submit to the regulator is held under confidence. But I really think that just like when drugs come to market, their clinical studies and trials are published. You know the results. And in fact, anyone in the pharmaceutical sector will know what trials are happening, and there'll be mid-trial reports saying it's starting to look promising, or we're looking like this endpoint is achievable. And I think with AI medical devices, it feels a bit murky sometimes, especially to the buyers. It's like suddenly this new startup's come along. They say they've got a CE mark, but they've got no sort of information on which they can really look at and examine scientifically and trust. So I think transparency is important. So I guess that's transparency from the developers, but also transparency from the regulators about what have they looked at. So those are sort of two of the generic gaps.
So I've got a follow-up question about that. FDA does have a sort of central database in which you have a list of all the companies that have gotten FDA approval. You've got summaries of their application processes. In the EU, you just don't have any of this. So do you think the FDA model is the way to go? Do you see other ways of going?
No, I absolutely think it's the way to go. And in fact, we have a project that we're working on. It's a government-funded project under what's known as the Centre of Excellence for Regulatory Science Innovation, or CERSI for short. So we are working with the University of Birmingham under this CERSI to build a global database of regulatory cleared medical devices. What we're doing is, no one's done this before, is map regulatory information from across different jurisdictions. So we got access to databases from the FDA, from Europe, from the UK. That's what we're starting with, but we will expand to Australia, Canada, Japan, China, etc. And then because there's a concept called UDI, which is Unique Device Identifier, we know that if someone registered a device with the same identifier in Europe and America, that we can pull across their evidence that they've submitted to the FDA that might be in their publicly available summary. And then using AI, we can parse out that information from the summaries and then show the Europeans this is what they said to the American regulators. We're also linking that with PubMed searches. So if the manufacturer has been named in a peer-reviewed paper that's published and got a DOI number, then we can link the research to it. So we're trying to open up that transparency. Just like you would for drugs. I'm sure you're aware there are drug formularies where you can look up any drug. We think there should be the same globally for medical devices. I guess your question was more pointed at what are the gaps in specific guidance and standards around AI. Where the gaps are it's guidance around cutting-edge technologies. So there's very little guidance internationally from regulators on large language models, large vision models, multimodal AI, agentic AI, or any of the new generative AI kind of breed of algorithms. I think the path for what I would call stochastic deep learning or machine learning systems is relatively well trodden and relatively simple to get a regulatory clearance for if you follow the process. But to date, there are zero generative AI systems. We are at really early stages for this kind of AI. So The reason that there's no guidance is because no one's done it, and you can't really write guidance on something until someone's done it and someone's gone, actually, that's a good way of doing it, and then you write guidance to inform everybody else. So there's always a regulatory lag. And people often get surprised. They're like, oh, I can't use a cutting edge model. ChatGPT just came out yesterday. Why can't I use it in a medical device? It's like, well, these things take time. Be a little bit more patient and you will get there. And I always point back to the deep learning systems. AlexNet smashed all benchmarks in 2012. It wasn't until, I think, 2018 we got the first C mark. So, there's a 6-year gap. So these things do take time, unfortunately. But that's the amount of time it takes to prove that things are safe, effective, and cyber secure. And as always in life, in any sector, if you're the first person to be doing something and breaking new ground, it will take the longest amount of time because you were the first to do it.
Another thing that I think can be quite challenging with AI is it doesn't really fit the traditional economic models of assessing their value. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, and I thank you for bringing up health economics. It's a lesser known subdivision of what we at Hardian do, but also what the health tech sector actually needs. I often say to people, you can get a CE mark, you can get an FDA clearance, but that does not guarantee anyone's going to pay for it at all. It just shows that you've built something that's safe and effective and does what you claim. It doesn't show that it actually provides value. And how do you provide value in medicine? Through a few ways. One, you either reduce costs or you improve care. So those are kind of the two main ways. Ideally, you do both. You improve care at a reduced cost, and then you're a very attractive proposition. What health economics does is aims to model that quantifiably. You do have to use some assumptions, so it's not a sort of exact science per se. But by proper modelling of a care pathway with and without the AI, by getting a good idea of what the costs are at each point in that care pathway, and then measuring the impact of an AI intervention, how that changes the pathway, whether it reduces costs or improves care or life expectancy or quality of life, then you can start to build a health economic argument. We were commissioned by the European Commission actually to do a literature review systematically of health economic models published on AI. There's really only about 30 papers published, so it's a really small area of research. And of those, probably not even half really use full, proper health economic methodologies that would be sort of considered scientifically robust. So yeah, we have a health economist on our team, and she has been working on this for the past few years. And we've actually just submitted, and it's been accepted for publication, but it hasn't been published yet, the first full health economic assessment of AI, specifically for fracture detection in the emergency department. So clearly the value there is radiologists don't always get to report x-rays in a timely fashion, especially within that 4-hour golden window of the emergent care presentation. And so the AI can detect fractures and flag them to the emergency clinicians, so hopefully they will miss fewer fractures. But more importantly, they make better referrals onwards to either fracture clinics or, if it's a normal x-ray, to send them away home. And we've managed to show through extensive modelling, collecting a lot of data from different NHS sites and looking at the cost of the AI deployment and the improvement in performance from the physicians, that there is a significant cost saving to be had. And then that will allow the company, hopefully, to then approach hospitals and say, look, we can save you X amount per year. How about we do a deal where we get a percentage of that cost saving that we generate for you? And I think that is the way that drugs are modelled and then sold, and that's how they figure out what price they should be sold for. And I think it's no different for AI systems. The challenge is that AI systems aren't obviously doing what drugs do. They aren't curing things, they aren't treating things. They are assisting clinicians in things, and the price of that is actually quite difficult to measure. We don't have a trusted health economic unit of time saved, for instance, or effective triage or things like this, which is what these AI systems are doing.
And so, as you say, proving that economic value to potential clients and hospitals is one of potentially the most difficult things. But more broadly, we see that there are lots of AI tools that have been FDA approved. And it's really just the first step in that whole journey of going to market and getting much more adoption. So what are some of the other adoption barriers that you see? Why hasn't AI been adopted so much more at this stage?
I think it's a good question. One of the fundamental issues with the current batch of AI that's got regulatory clearance is that it is all assistive AI. So it's helping someone do their job. Whereas what the evangelical tech bros spout about AI is that it's going to replace people. And I think until we get a bit closer to autonomous AI systems in healthcare, you can't really push the needle on the value, because you're having to pay for the AI and the human to do their job. So the AI has to have quite a substantial impact on that person's job in order to generate a cost saving. Whereas if you have an autonomous system, then you can start to say, well, actually, we are doing part of what a human does. A human does not need to do this anymore. And I think where systems are looking at these AI products, they're going, well, that's a nice to have. It's not like I need to have. It's nice to be able to have something assisting you reading your chest x-rays or reading your electrocardiograms or whatever it might be. But what would be really wonderful to have is a system that can just report the entire chest x-ray and a human doesn't need to look at it. And I think we're kind of in that nascent early part of the sector where we're going to move from these lower risk class 2 devices up into more autonomous systems, class 3, which are taking over parts of the work. And I'm not for a minute suggesting people will lose their jobs, but what it means is that part of the mundane part of routine clinical work will be more and more automated by AI systems.
If you were the head of the MHRA tomorrow, what are some of the very concrete changes that you'd make in terms of organization or more policy that you'd like to see?
It's funny you asked that. I did have a meeting with the new head of the MHRA just last week.
Oh, what did you tell them?
We just chatted about this and that. He's settling into his new job.
Okay.
Lovely guy named Lawrence Talon. If I was head of the MHRA, not that I would ever want to be, and it's not the kind of thing I think I would enjoy. What would I do? I mean, I'm very much focused on software. And you've got to remember that the MHRA, like 80% of what it does is drugs, right? About 20% is medical devices, so contact lenses, hip prostheses, scanners, things like that. And like 2% maybe is software. So it's like a tiny part of the market segment. But what would I do if I was coming in and AI was my focus? I would definitely be beefing up their software and AI teams. I think they're a bit understaffed in that regard. They have an opportunity in our post-Brexit environment to do something different to what the Europeans have done. And I have one idea. I have no idea how practical it might be, but could be incredibly interesting for software medical device developers, is that you could look to one of the annexes in the medical device regulations, which says that there is a different route to conformity other than verification, validation of an individual product with its individual clinical evidence. And it's more an examination of the type of product. So what I mean by that is that you could potentially set up a regulatory regime where a company gets certified to produce medical grade AI. So they have the quality management systems, the cybersecurity in place. But it's not the individual products that are then required to generate evidence and have individual submissions. It's more the companies allowed to produce medical grade AI under its license to manufacture. We have a similar thing kind of in the food industry, for instance. So people are allowed to make jam or whatever it might be, and you don't examine every jar of jam to make sure that it's fit for purpose. You do batch testing and you quality assure the process. And I think that might fit the future of software medical device. If we think that in the future larger companies are going to get into this space, producing hundreds of algorithms and bits of software a year, it doesn't really make sense to make them do 100 different submissions. It makes more sense to have them certified as a software medical device manufacturer. Obviously you can do spot audits and checks on random bits and bobs as and so you desire. But I think that would be quite an exciting thing to explore and push towards. And I think, people would really want to go for that license. But I think that license would be relatively difficult to achieve, especially for small startups. So it may not be as attractive to the smaller players, but it would certainly be attractive to the larger players, I think.
Also, seeing that it's already a system that's in place in other sectors makes it much more realistic or transferable in a way. And as you mentioned earlier, the performance of these tools in the real world varies widely across different populations, across different machines, and across time. Do we need a radical shift towards post-market surveillance and post-market evidence generation?
The problem with post-market surveillance with AI systems is that we just don't have the infrastructure set up. So if we think about a practical example, let's say we have, a cancer screening or mammography AI. In order to know if the AI was right or wrong, you have to have downstream biopsy data, right? But we're just not, the radiology department is not linked in that way to the pathology department. And the company who has delivered that radiology AI product certainly does not have access to downstream pathology data, not in the live environment. And so Because healthcare data is so siloed and so locked away, it makes it incredibly difficult for anyone to do effective post-market surveillance. And it's kind of left up to the purchasers of the AI, the hospital systems. So not only are they paying for the AI, they're also paying for the human to carry on doing their job, but they've also got to pay for people to actually do the post-market surveillance on behalf of the manufacturer because it's their legal requirement. So the system does need a bit of shift and a bit of change. But again, there are people working on this problem, people trying to provide platforms that you can aggregate this data and pull it out with clever de-anonymization techniques. So yeah, it's a massive area, again, at the cutting edge, and lots of exciting research.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to do a little rapid round of questions. So
Okay.
I'll throw some topics at you, and if you could tell me whether you think they're overrated or underrated and why.
Sure.
All right. So first one is the explainability criteria of AI.
Overrated.
Overrated. Why?
Because it doesn't matter if you can explain how an AI achieves its output as long as it's demonstrably accurate and correct, is my fundamental belief. And I think that is especially true when we're talking about generative AI. We have no idea why it selects the next token that it does, other than it's the most likely. But we don't know why it's the most likely. So I would say that trying to enforce people to put some pseudo-statistics around explainability, I think it sounds nice. And it sounds like, yes, we'll better understand the system. But AI does not think like us. And I don't think it's really important. The analogy I could use is going back to the car. Is you don't know how your car engine works. I mean, you do. You know, you put fuel in and something burns it and that creates pressure and that moves things. But you don't know the ins and outs, right? Only specialists really need to know the ins and outs. And I think it's probably the same for AI. By all means, if you're interested to know, fine, go ahead and study that and research it. But I think, generically, the average user of clinical AI does not need to really understand that.
Okay. The next one is third-party audits for software as a medical device.
Underrated.
Why?
So, well, that's how the regulatory system works in Europe and the UK. It's all third-party audits. Even in America, technically the FDA is a single regulatory authority, but they do outsource some of their auditing to, qualified third parties as well. And I think it's massively underrated. I think having someone independent and not, enamored or in love with your product and can see the wood from the trees is actually a really valuable exercise, and it makes your product safer and better. It makes your quality assurance processes more robust. So I'm a big fan of third-party audit.
Okay. Third and last one. What about always having a human in the loop?
Overrated.
Why?
As I said before, I would like to see a shift to more autonomous Class 3 devices. I think having a human in the loop gives us a false sense of security and hope over these things. But there is evidence starting to show that the really performant models are just better than humans in some, niche examples. And I think having a human in the loop sometimes actually reduces the performance demonstrably. The research is starting to show in some use cases, not all. But I think when we get to autonomous systems, I think the only human you need to have in the loop are people in charge of quality assurance and post-market surveillance. I don't think you need a human in the loop at every single output event or clinical decision that's being made, as long as they've got the appropriate regulatory clearance to do so. So I think over time, humans can move more and more out of the loop.
Okay. Thanks for playing along. My final question is, in the next few years, what's the one change that you are most focused on making real?
I think, other than the regulatory transparency side of things, what I really want to be able to do is produce it to distill the knowledge that myself and my team have gathered over the past decade, and to provide that in some form of software platform that is intuitive to new users, and they can come in and start using it and become regulatory compliant at their own pace in their own work environment. I think that's kind of something that's missing in the regulatory consulting space. So I think that's one change that I would like to make. I'm not entirely sure how we get there. We are working on a few proof of concepts in that regard. But, there's a lot of people who sell EQMSs, which are electronic quality management systems. But they're sort of more document management systems and standard procedure management systems. What I'm talking about is automating record generation as the software developers are doing their normal job, and kind of being that software platform through which you do your software development that automatically creates all the regulatory documentation that you need to do. So that is something that I think I can at least push towards that kind of change. And I'm sure other people have similar ideas and are working on similar things. I just think that the experience that we have in this space over the past decade will help us build something towards that goal.
Okay. Thank you very much for these very inspiring words and sharing, distilling your knowledge in this podcast. If listeners want to know more, what's the best way to reach you?
So we have a website, hardianhealth.com, or you can email me, hugh@hardianhealth.com. I'm also on LinkedIn every day, so ping me a message.
Thank you.
Alice, thank you so much, and thank you for having me on the first edition. I will be subscribing and hopefully listening to many more of your interviews.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the first episode. If you enjoyed it, push the subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. Thank you.